Hi, I'm Ken Brusso. I'm CEO of Decision Dynamics LLC, and I'm co-creator of the Decision Dynamics Insight Assessment Series. Today, I want to introduce you to the Emotional Competencies module of the series. At first, we'll take a quick look at the whole set of 6 competencies, and then we'll go into each of them in more detail, and we'll talk about what difference it makes to be high or low on any one of these emotional competencies. Emotional competencies have a big impact on how we respond and experience different kinds of situations, and also on how other people may experience us and each other. They can be difficult to perceive and difficult to discern. They can be easily misunderstood because they revolve around internal states that aren't necessarily visible externally. So the first thing today is I'd like you to gain some important insights by going through this presentation and watching this video. And then later on, if you're interested, you can access the insight assessments to gain even more understanding of the emotional competencies and where you stand on these 6 important factors. If you're a leader and you have a team, you can put the insight assessments to work to better understand how and why your team members may respond differently to different kinds of situations and to each other. If you're a coach and an organization consultant, you can put the insight assessments to work to build better teamwork and better team insight. That all said, let's get directly into the presentation I prepared for you on emotional competencies. So when I say emotional competency, what I'm talking about are factors that determine how people respond to circumstances or situations, and especially interpersonal situations in which there are emotional and motivational factors that come into play. The set of emotional competencies that in particular we look at are 6. You can see them here on the screen. First of all, ambiguity tolerance, simply the amount of uncertainty, ambiguity, anything that is unclear, difficult to predict. The degree to which people are comfortable dealing with those kinds of circumstances. Composure is the second emotional competency we look at, and that's simply the degree to which a person is likely to stay cool, calm, collected in circumstances that perhaps could be stressful or anxiety producing. The third emotional competency is empathy, and that's the amount of energy that a person is likely to invest in understanding other people, in being able to perceive and anticipate other people's reactions. The fourth is interpersonal adaptability, and that's simply a person's likelihood to shift or adapt different behaviors to deal with different circumstances or particularly different individuals or groups of individuals. The fifth emotional competency is mental energy, and that's the amount of mental energy that a person can sustain when dealing with complexity over a significant period of time. And the sixth emotional competency is confidence, and that's simply a person's degree of self-assurance and to some extent ambition. So, well, let's jump into each of these emotional competencies and look at them in a bit more detail. Okay, in this segment, I'm going to go over each of the 6 emotional competencies that I just mentioned and take a little deeper look into what each of them mean. What does it mean to be really high or real low on each of these emotional competencies? So without ado, let's have a look at each of them, beginning with the ambiguity tolerance. Ambiguity tolerance, as you may recall, is simply a person's capacity to feel comfortable with dealing with uncertainty, a variety, diversity, circumstances that may vary from expectations, where things aren't clear, anything can happen. So people who are particularly high on ambiguity tolerance tend to thrive in situations where anything can and does happen. where nothing can be predicted with any kind of accuracy, and there aren't any rules and guidelines that will work that you can follow with any kind of certainty. Things are uncertain. And all of these emotional competencies, incidentally, have a strong interpersonal component. So people who are high in ambiguity tolerance also tend to be attracted to diversity in the interpersonal environment. They will seek out people who are different from themselves and are different from each other as well. On the other hand, people who are low on ambiguity tolerance prefer order, routine, like to have things organized where things are relatively predictable and there are clear rules and guidelines to follow. Things don't vary greatly from expectations. And by and large, they feel comfortable mainly dealing with people who are quite like themselves, whom they can easily understand, and they're not going to get big surprises from them either. Now, this graph that I'm showing you here shows the average scores at 5 levels of management for the most successful people at each of those 5 levels, beginning on the left with first-line supervisors going all the way up to senior executives, C-suite executives on the far right. At each point on this graph, where the points are connected by that blue line, we can see a little bar. They're called confidence intervals, 95% confidence intervals. And all they mean is that we can be 95% sure that the true score of people in each of these groups, the most successful people, do fall within that range. And you can see that range is very narrow, particularly at the most senior levels where we have actually a lot more people in our database. This is a very clear pattern here. There can be no doubt with the thousands of people we're looking at. This is based upon a sample of a population of 154,000 managers and executives whom we've assessed worldwide. We're looking at the 20% most successful. In each case, it's well over 1,000 people. So this leaves no doubt that as the most successful people ascend the executive ladder, we find they have higher and higher levels of ambiguity tolerance. Now let's talk about the so what. What difference does it make if a person scores real high or real low on ambiguity tolerance? A word of caution is in order here for all 6 of these emotional competencies. Please guard against the notion that it's always better to score high versus low on these emotional competencies, because that's not the case. They all exist on a continuum ranging from very high to very low, and problems can occur at either end of these continua. So with respect to ambiguity tolerance, if a person's score is too high for the situation at hand, or if that person's level of ambiguity tolerance is too low for the situation at hand, problems can occur in either one of these situations. So let's have a look at specifically what issues could arise with respect specifically to ambiguity tolerance. So if a person's level of ambiguity tolerance is too high for the situation the person faces, then the danger is that the person can become bored. And when people can become bored, they look for stimulation. So the person might introduce a lot more complexity or even disorder, mess up the situation to make it a little more interesting and therefore more stimulating, more motivating. The person may also ignore standard rules and operating protocols that may exist for the situation if that person's ambiguity tolerance is too high. On the other hand, if that person's ambiguity tolerance is too low with respect to the situation at hand, then the danger is that the individual could become rattled, stressed, feeling anxious in the face of all of this uncertainty. There's a phenomenon we call a boomerang effect that could set in, whereby in response to all the moving things here going on, the person could become even more rigid with respect to the situation at hand, and fail to adapt to real situations that do require good responses, even though they weren't predicted or they weren't anticipated ahead of time. So you can see issues exist at either end of the continua with respect to what's required in the situation. Different situations require different amounts of ambiguity tolerance because they involve more or less uncertainty. Our next emotional competence is composure. As you've already heard me say, composure reflects the capacity of an individual to stay calm in circumstances that can be anxiety-producing and threatening. So when those circumstances do arrive, people who score high on composure tend to stay calm, and that gives them the ability to look into this situation more deeply in order to perceive what potentially can be done to handle the circumstance. And in as much as they appear unflustered, their calm helps other people stay calm, focused, and able to think clearly in the face of threats and anxiety-producing situations. On the other hand, people who are relatively low on composure, they have the tendency to lose their cool when dangers arrive or when blocked and frustrated. Their reactions are quite visible emotionally, and this does help other people understand their feelings and their views on things. However, when their emotions are quite intense, they can spill over and impact on the other people around them and cause those other people to become stressed and lose their ability to think clearly and analytically in the face of threats. Here's the chart showing how scores on composure tend to increase, again, as the most successful leaders rise up in the organization. It isn't the steepest of curves that we see, but it's very clear that there is this gentle rise in levels of composure as people rise up in the organization. Concerning mismatches, when a person's composure score is too high for the situation, that is, they're too composed, they can seem uninvolved, detached, aloof, distant from the situation and from other people around them. And this can make it difficult for other people to read them. And that in itself can be, ironically, anxiety producing for other people. When an individual's composure is too low for the situation at hand, their visible emotional reactions, as I pointed out, can cause stress in other people. Particularly for leaders, this can cause other people to lose confidence in them or lose the respect of other people. The third emotional competency I'm going to talk about is empathy. And empathy, as we define it, simply reflects the amount of energy a person is inclined to invest in understanding other people's behavior, their preferences, their likely reactions. People who score high on empathy tend to see other people as different, as not falling into any simple good or bad categories. And consequently, they tend to thrive fairly well dealing with a wide diversity of people. They tend to be responsive to other people's feelings and attitudes, but without becoming overly enmeshed and taking on other people's feelings, attitudes as their own. They tend to adjust their communication and behavior according to their perceptions of how different people are likely to respond or hear their messages. In fact, they're likely to adjust their behavior more readily in dealing with differences. On the other hand, people who are low on empathy are often puzzled by other people's behavior. They may not put much of their energy into anticipating how people will respond to different kinds of messages or different kinds of circumstances. And then later on, they may be surprised by the kinds of reactions they get. And they might simply have an inclination to judge people as being good versus bad without seeing the range of other possibilities beyond those two extremes. And here again, I'm showing the average scores of the most successful people at each of the 5 levels of management, from first-line supervisors all the way up to the senior-most C-suite executives on the right here. And you can see this is a pretty steep curve going up. It leaves no doubt that The most successful people become increasingly empathetic as they rise up on the executive ladder. This probably reflects the fact that interpersonal demands and interactions become more and more complex and important at the more senior levels of management. When empathy is too high for the situation at hand, people can become too easily swayed by other people's feelings and perceptions. In other words, in the extreme case, they might take on those other people's feelings as though they were their own and lose sight of their own actual feelings or other principles that may be important in the circumstance. In fact, they may often create too many exceptions, make too many exceptions to accommodate other people, and consequently, rules, guidelines, principles tend to get lost in translation, and oftentimes there are repercussions that have unanticipated consequences for other people as well. When empathy is too low for the situation, the tendency might be to simply take people at face value and not see the more subtleties in their behavior. They may be surprised, as I pointed out before, about how people respond to situations and fail to accurately anticipate ahead of time how people react to different kinds of messages and circumstances. This overall can give them, particularly as leaders, a narrow bandwidth for dealing with diversity in the styles, preferences, and behavior of other people. And overall, they may make superficial judgments about where people stand on things. So, how's your mental energy? Well, we all have our good days and our not so good days. Some of us tend to have a lot more mental energy than the rest of us. And some of us don't have as much mental energy as the rest of us. So when I say mental energy as an emotional competency, I'm talking about a person's capacity to handle complex and demanding tasks over a long period of time without tiring, without losing motivation. So individuals with high mental energy tend to stand out from other people as more intense, more alive even. They walk into a room, it isn't long before they're noticed. They just tend to exude more energy, more intensity. They tend to be able to handle many difficult problems and work long hours without losing their ability to process information, and they tend to persist until they achieve a high quality result. On the other hand, people with low mental energy tend to become discouraged in the face of complexity. They'll lose their motivations, they'll lose their ability to process information, and they may opt for simple solutions, simple analyses that miss important facets of an issue, or they may simply withdraw and put their attention on other things and leave other important tasks undone or incomplete. Here's the graph showing the progression of scores on the executive ladder from entry level all the way up to the C-suite. And you can see there's an increase at each of the successive rungs on the ladder, suggesting that the work itself becomes more complex, more demanding, and requires more mental energy as individuals rise up through the hierarchy. So when mental energy is too high for the situation, you can get problems just as you can when mental energy is too low. In the case of mental energy being too high for the situation at hand, the chances are a person is likely to feel understimulated, under-challenged. They could become easily distracted and lose their efficiency. They may overcomplicate even simple tasks or simple decisions, create problems to compensate for the absence of stimulation they're experiencing, and in the process, they may overwhelm other people with all their intensity and the complexity they bring to things. When mental energy is too low for the situation at hand, the chances are a person is going to start to feel overwhelmed and stressed in the face of the task demands. The person is likely to lose motivation and get into perhaps a negative cycle of decreasing energy and motivation over time The person may oversimplify decisions and tasks or ignore key issues, make errors of judgment, leave important things undone, or important opportunities unrecognized. And now I come to the fifth emotional competence, interpersonal adaptability. And here I'm talking about a person's capability to adapt his or her behavior to different kinds of circumstances, especially to different kinds of people who think and behave differently, as opposed to becoming ego invested in doing things just one particular way. So people who score high on our scale of interpersonal adaptability tend to easily modify how they do things as situations shift and change. They can adapt their behavior to different kinds of interpersonal situations, and they can go more than half the way to accommodate someone else whose styles and behavior are different from the person's own behavior. They find it relatively easy to share credit with their teammates and coworkers. And we find that people who are high on interpersonal adaptability tend to get high marks by their teammates and coworkers as being easy to work with. People, on the other hand, who score low on interpersonal adaptability tend to have a narrow bandwidth people they deal well with. They can deal well with, and so often very well with, people who are much like themselves, but not so well with other people who are different in some ways from themselves. They find it difficult to shift their behavior from situation to situation. They tend to be habit bound, doing things in one particular way, as I said, as a matter of habit or simply as a matter of principle. So getting along is not the most important thing for them. Doing things in one particular way would be a much more higher priority for them. Here I'm showing the average scores of the most successful people at each of the 5 levels again. And now you see that this chart looks different from the others we're looking at. We see that at the first line supervisor level, scores on interpersonal adaptability for the most successful people increase up to middle level management, and then they turn around and they go back down a little bit to lower levels at the very higher levels of management at the C-suite executive level. Not all the way down to where they were as first line supervisors, but they do gradually go down. Now, the question arises, what happens when a person's level of interpersonal adaptability is too high or too low for the situation at hand? We find that a person whose adaptability is too high for the situation at hand tend to be misperceived as lacking confidence or lacking conviction, because other people see them behaving differently in different kinds of situations, and they may seem different in different kinds of situations as well. They may not have a lot of impact on other people because they're putting a lot of their energy into accommodating others rather than pushing other people, at least visibly pushing other people in particular ways to adhere to particular principles or ways of doing things. So it could also be the case that they might actually place less value on their own ideas and their own ways of doing things that come to them quite naturally. On the other hand, when interpersonal adaptability is too low for the situation at hand, there's a tendency to deal exactly in the same way with everyone, every situation, always the same way, very consistent. People who are low on interpersonal adaptability tend to find it very difficult to modify their behavior and their way of thinking to accommodate different kinds of situations and people. They may find it very difficult to adapt to situations where it's very clear that their normal way of behaving and thinking is not going to work well in that situation. They'll tend to stick with the way they typically do things. So consequently, their bandwidth tends to be very narrow. They may be really great within a particular range, but when they get outside that range, things tend to break down. Confidence is the last of the set of 6 emotional competencies that we're going to look at. Now, when I say confidence in this particular context as an emotional competency, I'm specifically talking about a person's willingness to take on very tough and challenging assignments that may involve high amounts of risk, and especially dealing with a lot of conflict and tension between people. People who are high on confidence in this particular sense tend to be eager to accept responsibility and authority. They believe in themselves. They believe themselves capable of handling all kinds of challenging circumstances and situations that may arise, as long as they have sufficient authority or discretion to do so. They enjoy exercising authority and power, and they're not easily intimidated by the views of other people who may oppose them. In short, they are very self-assured. People, on the other hand, who are low on confidence tend to be easily daunted in the face of challenges and tensions. They shy away from risk, and especially those that involve conflict with other people. And they are potentially intimidated by other people who may have very strong views on things. And they could be inclined to give up responsibility and authority in order to avoid conflict and tensions. Here, I'm showing the scores on confidence for the most successful people at each of the 5 levels of management. And this is a very steep climb. This goes up quite dramatically from first level supervisory management on up to the C-suite, as you can see. And that probably reflects the fact that situations that you must deal with as you climb the executive ladder become increasingly complex and also have a higher potential to involve tensions and conflicts between and among other people. When confidence is too high for the situation at hand, a person can seem arrogant and thereby might offend other people. They might have a tendency to dominate other people, or disregard their input, or unintentionally squelch input from other people and thereby cut themselves off from other important information. They could, in the process, intimidate other people who are feeling less certain than they are, and they might become, over time, overly self-reliant and too dependent just on themselves and fail to connect with the ideas and information that other people could bring to the situation. On the other hand, when confidence is too low for the situation at hand, the person might avoid or delay taking action on situations that demand action but involve controversy and tensions. They could acquiesce too easily in face of pressure from other people, and they concede to opposing points of views too readily. They could also fail to protect important policies and procedures that need to be guarded. In the process, they could lose important opportunities by avoiding tensions and conflicts. Having completed our tour of the 6 emotional competencies, I'd now like to take you on another little tour, in this case, to look at the profiles of people who've actually been assessed using the Decision Dynamics Emotional Competencies Assessment. So the first one we're going to look at, you can see right here on the screen. This shows the whole layout for the report you would get if you were to run this on yourself or on someone else. You see the graphs. The graphs show the relative strength of each of the 6 emotional competencies. And the text here is geared to the actual scores of the person. So it's tailored to reflect what's implied by the person's profile on each of the 6 emotional competencies. Here's a profile for a different person. There are a few things I'd like to point out here. First of all, 4 is about average for the many thousands of people in our database who've been through this assessment. So you can see that in this case, the person's scores are not high on anything. They're at best moderately average. Nonetheless, I put a lot of importance on what's higher and what's lower in the profile. In this case, you can see that the person's scores are relatively high compared to the others on composure, mental energy, and confidence. What that suggests is this person can be cool and composed. In tough situations where there's a lot of risk going on, This might be someone you'd like to have by your side who's not going to easily get rattled. The person is going to be relatively confident that he or she can deal with tough interpersonal situations. This is not someone who's going to put a lot of mental energy into anticipating and thinking about other people's feelings, nor in adapting to different behavior and styles of other people. So, as I said, this might be someone you'd like to have by your side in a very tough, risk-prone situation, who's going to stay cool and calm and not get a lot ruffled by it. Who's going to be relatively confident. But likewise, over the long haul, this person is probably going to need some coaching and assistance in anticipating and thinking about other people's feelings and needs before taking action. Here's another person's profile. And this one is very different from the previous one we just looked at. In this case, this person is very comfortable dealing with uncertainty, change, probably prefers to work in a dynamic, changing environment where everything can't be predicted with a lot of accuracy ahead of time, is quite comfortable and confident that he or she will be able to handle most any type of challenge that comes along. So is not going to be intimidated by the change and the interpersonal dynamics of the situation at hand. You can see that overall the person's scores tend to be a bit elevated over average. So we can be pretty sure this person is going to be fairly intense. You're going to notice this person. You'll feel the presence of this person when you're around that person. One of the things that he or she might need to watch out for is not to overwhelm other people who are less comfortable with change and uncertainty than he or she is. Here's another profile, yet again different. In this case, we can see that this person's scores overall tend to be moderate, maybe a little bit lower, especially on confidence. That big spike we see here on interpersonal adaptability suggests that this person is putting a lot of energy into trying to accommodate other people. The low confidence scores indicates that this person is not going to be comfortable dealing with tensions and conflicts among people, and probably worries a lot about displeasing other people or taking actions that might offend someone. What he or she needs to watch out for is to be careful not to lose sight of objectively important issues just because he or she is getting some pushback from other people. What this person needs to watch out for is not to lose sight of objectively important issues and principles and let other people's opposing feelings sweep them away. Needs to keep those objectively important issues in mind and guard against losing his or her own position, ideas, and needs in trying to accommodate other people. Probably this person needs to bear in mind that it's not possible to please everyone all the time. This brings us to the end of this segment on emotional competencies. I've described the 6 emotional competencies very briefly, and then I've gone into each of them in more detail, and I've commented on what can happen if people go too far in either direction, i.e. they have more of a particular competency than needed for a particular situation, or they have too little of an emotional competency that may be needed for a different situation. Knowledge of these important competencies should contribute to your increased self-insight and increase your ability to recognize these important reactions in other people. And knowledge of these competencies should also increase your skill at dealing with a wide range of situations, and especially those that are emotionally charged. This has all been part of our Insight series, and I do hope that this segment has contributed to your insights, and I thank you very much for watching.